The presenting sponsor for the Intersections podcast is Lynn, Pinker, Hurst, and Schwegman. Built on a culture of winning, these trial lawyers have proven experience, elite preparation, and relentless focus in the areas of commercial, intellectual property, and employment litigation. Visit Lynn LLP to learn more. And thank you so much to the Lynn, Pinker, Hurst, and Schwegman Group for all you're doing to support the Intersections podcast. This episode is brought to you in partnership by Clay Cooley Automotive, family-owned, family-operated automotive company serving the local DFW Metroplex for over 22 years. Clay, thank you for all you're doing to make Intersections possible. Headquartered in Dallas, Texas, Arcus Golf is a premier owner and operator of nearly 90 private, resort, and daily fee courses in the U.S., including Cowboys Golf Club, the world's first and only NFL-themed golf club, and 8 other courses right here in the DFW Metroplex. Arcus is an innovative industry leader providing unrivaled lifestyle amenities that complement exceptional golf offerings. To learn more, visit arcusgolf.com, and thank you to the Arcus team for all that you do to make Intersections happen.
Well, Kyle, part 2. Now, this is a conversation with Robert Jordan, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, about his time as an ambassador. And of course, he was designated an ambassador just before 9/11, confirmed and sworn in just after 9/11, and he walks into a world that has completely come apart.
You got it. So he's the man that is tasked with how do we kind of re-normalize or make relations actually with Saudi Arabia right after 9/11. He tells incredible stories of working with President Bush and Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, but also the princes and the people in charge in Saudi Arabia on the ground. A fascinating listen as he shares the in-depth experience of someone who was there and lived it.
Anybody interested in modern history, this is a highlight. It's one of the days you always ask, where was I on 9/11?
Correct. And he really is living history. He was a consequential piece in a difficult time, in a difficult era, in a tough place. Tune in. Welcome to Intersections. We take a multi-generational look at the critical issues facing America. Tom, introduce our guest.
We've been very fortunate in the podcasts that we've done, some fascinating people. This one is a special one to me. Robert Jordan's with us. Ambassador Jordan was the ambassador to Saudi Arabia 2001, 2003. As we'll get into it, probably one of the more significant diplomatic assignments given the time sensitivity where that fell into history, probably of any diplomat that we've seen. Longtime partner at Baker & Botts, headed up the Middle East office there, president of the Dallas Bar Association, and on and on. Ambassador Jordan, it's great to have you with us today.
Great to be with you, Tom and Kyle.
Maybe the way to start this is from 60,000 feet, give us your perspective on the Middle East today, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time of how you got involved and how you've become an historical figure related to the Middle East.
Well, it's the Middle East is certainly in turmoil today. I think they're facing some of the cross currents of change, but they also have longstanding rivalries, hatreds, and cultural impediments. My friend Richard Haas, who was president of the Council on Foreign Relations for many years, says about the Middle East, it can always get worse before it gets worse. And so I keep that thought in the back of my mind.
A good start to us. Let's go back, though. Let's talk about Robert Jordan. You grew up in Texas, but you had a period where your family lived in Peru, and then your father, after that, was involved in a number of international assignments. Hong Kong, actually U.S. aid in Vietnam. Was that the makings of being a diplomat?
Well, maybe. By the way, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, mostly, and came to Texas as soon as I could, which was after law school. Yeah, I think living abroad as a young child was pivotal in how I viewed the world, how my family viewed the world. We moved to Peru when I was 3 years old. I had my third birthday in Lima in the middle of a revolution. They couldn't get icing for my cake. And so they gave me whipped cream on the cake, which apparently I cried about, according to my parents. And so Spanish was my everyday language for 2 years. I went to kindergarten there. And so once we returned to Tulsa, I think dinner table conversation was different. We talked about international things. We would sort of slip into Spanglish occasionally and use Spanish words from time to time. And then keeping track of my dad and his career after that was also something that was very important to me.
And you said conversations would be, Marcus, to revolutions.
Exactly. Yeah. It was, my dad was in the oil field supply business. And so he would be very involved in international shipping, supply chain issues, things that have become very important these days.
And U.S. aid in Vietnam during the war years?
Yes. He was there during the Tet Offensive. He was there 4 years. He took turns in his apartment building standing guard on the rooftop with a rifle. He was evacuated finally. He developed some health issues and was evacuated right at the end of his time there. Went back to Washington, D.C. then for about 10 or 15 years and retired after that.
And then you went to Duke undergraduate.
Mm-hmm.
We won't talk about the meltdown of the regional final on that.
It was tough.
Yeah.
But kind of the makings of a diplomat, you focused on Russian and French.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I took those courses. And in fact, when my parents lived in Hong Kong, I was a sophomore, I guess, at Duke. And they had rented a house from a Russian lady. And her sons, who were Russian-American, were taking Russian lessons from a tutor. So they asked if I'd like to take those lessons as well, and it seemed pretty cool to me. And so that's how I got started. And then I studied in college as well, along with the obligatory French courses that we took in high school and college.
Was the intent at that time to kind of pursue international relations? You later got a master's at Maryland in international relations. But where did it come? Was it that family early years that kind of gave you the interest of at least engaging in international relations?
I think I was interested in engaging the Russian language because Russia, of course, was a big threat at that time. Knowing Russian struck me as being a nice thing to have. And it was just kind of cool. It was just kind of fun. And I enjoyed the teacher. The teacher was a woman named Mrs. Kott, and she was a Russian emigre. Her husband, who was much older than she was, had actually been in the 1919 movie 10 Days That Shook the World about the rise of the Bolsheviks. So all of this was just kind of cool and fun.
So I want to jump in here on, you clearly diversified from a cultural and language perspective. Any leadership lessons you took away from your learnings, academic learnings, and then how did those ultimately translate into your real interest getting into public service?
I think one of the things that stuck with me is sort of a trite phrase in a way, but where you stand depends on where you sit. And each country gets to have their own culture. They get to have their own foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And part of our job is to try to understand it so we can either work with it or deal with them as an adversary. But you've got to understand it first. And so that I think was a guidepost that stuck with me for a really long time.
Is that a problem today in the sense that here in the United States, a lot of times we're myopic. We think and assume people think, react, have the same logic that we do.
Sure.
As you just said, that's not the case. Is that a limitation on our foreign policy?
It's very much a limitation. I think it's part of being a democracy also, because politicians listen to their constituents. The constituents are not fully educated, nor should you expect them to be. I mean, some of this stuff is pretty arcane. But just as an example, after the World Trade Center was attacked by Saudis, 15 of the 19 hijackers of the airplanes were Saudis. A lot of religious figures and a lot of politicians around the country were calling for us to start bombing Riyadh instead of Afghanistan, showing how little they understood that actually the royal family in Saudi Arabia was as much opposed to Osama bin Laden as the rest of us. And so you've just got to understand where people come from before you start making wild predictions.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't go international relations. Instead, you went to Oklahoma, law school, editor-in-chief of the Law Review. Mm-hmm. What led you to law?
It was almost by default to start with. I was planning to go to law school straight out of college, but my draft board had other ideas. And they were no longer giving 2S deferments to people going to law school. So I was facing either waiting for the draft notice to come or doing something proactive. Mm-hmm. And so I signed up for Navy Officer Candidate School. And luckily I got in. And that, I think, had another impact on my view of international affairs because obviously as a naval officer.
Navy security, right?
It was. I was assigned to the National Security Group, the Naval Security Group in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters. And
what do they do?
Well, they are the signals intelligence people. They work for NSA, the National Security Agency, and so they're cryptologists. Most of the enlisted men who worked for me had PhDs in computer science or something like that. We have massive banks of computers that probably could be handled on our iPhones today, but rooms and rooms full of them. And so I was living in Washington at a really important time as well. A number of my classmates from Duke had taken jobs on the Hill. And so it was, again, kind of an intoxicating feel to be near the center of a lot of cool stuff going on. Mm-hmm. Our station was responsible for basically administering all of the Navy cryptologists around the world. Many of them were stationed on minesweepers because they have wooden holes, and they can then eavesdrop without being detected quite as easily. They had a lot of highly sophisticated, in those days, technology that they worked with. So it was really just a fascinating time to be there.
Spent time at Baker Botts. Jim Baker, of course, the name in Baker Botts, and we'll talk about it later, was a real mentor of yours. So you did that, but then you came up in business litigation, and you ended up with a client by the name of George W. Bush.
Yeah.
Of course, he was the one that appointed you ambassador, but let's go back to the relationship. Mm-hmm. He was facing pretty significant SEC insider trading charges. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Harken Energy, you got involved and you spent 2 years clearing him.
Yeah, there were really never any charges brought, but there was a very deep and detailed investigation, and I'm sure because of his profile, the investigators were extra thorough and didn't want to cut him any slack, which was appropriate. This was in early, I think 1991 maybe. So he had...
So pre-gubernatorial, but became a key issue in the gubernatorial race.
It did. He had borrowed money to purchase his interest in the Texas Rangers baseball club. Mm-hmm. And so he sold some stock in Harken Energy in order to pay off that loan, about $800,000 as I recall. And he was also on the audit committee.
Padres just sold for $3+ billion.
Yeah, right. A little different numbers today.
He was on the audit committee of Harken, and they ended up reporting a substantial loss for the quarter in which he sold his stock. But of course, again, where you stand depends on where you sit. And in this case, the SEC hadn't quite connected the dots that when you close out a quarter, say June 30th, it doesn't mean you know everything about that quarter on June 30th. You have to have the auditors come in. Mm-hmm. You make some discretionary decisions on what you want to claim as a write-off or keep and work with it. And so it was another 6 weeks or so before they actually closed the quarter and reported the earnings loss. So that not only did he not know, but it was not knowable at the time he sold his stock what that quarter was really going to be. And the other telltale sign was when the quarter loss was announced, the stock only moved about 3 cents. And so it was clearly not material. Mm-hmm. Finally, after 2 years of haggling, the SEC understood these issues and dismissed the investigation. So that helped me in my relationship with my client because we had a pretty good result.
So years later, of course, he played a key role in nominating you ambassador. Go back to those initial years, though. Talk about the relationship with him as a client. Then you became friends, went to ball games, spent time in the in the governor's mansion.
Yeah.
Talk about that relationship early on.
Well, we just kind of hit it off. And of course, being at Baker Botts was helpful because Baker Botts had done some work for his father. The entire sort of Bush family had close connections, particularly in Houston, with the entire family. But we hit it off. He was a great client, very smart, very understanding of what the issues were. But he did say, Bob, I'm fixing to run for governor. And it would sure be nice if we could get rid of this thing before I start running for governor. And luckily, the SEC by this time had run out of gas, and they realized that there was nothing further there. But there were a lot of congressmen, a lot of Democrats looking at it to see if there was some chink in the armor.
What were the leadership qualities you saw in him early on? I mean, prior to his gubernatorial run and ultimately obviously being president, what did you see in him spending that much time with him? Decisiveness,
impatience with trivia, very quick, practical sensibility about him. He had gone to Harvard Business School, but he was not academically inclined in that sense. He was very analytical in a sort of West Texas kind of way. And if you've gone by the house he grew up in Midland, which I have done, I've driven by that house. It was quite modest, not nearly the kind of thing that we would think about. And it shows that he had a humility about him that I don't think many people understood. He would make jokes and kind of act like he's bragging, but in a sense, he really never felt that he was better than anybody else.
I was with him and did an event with him just a couple of weeks ago. And he started out with leadership characteristics. He started out with humility.
Yeah.
And I think he's a humble servant in a way. He's a servant leader.
Yep. So we then come to 2001. He has been elected president. Interestingly enough, you were a supporter, but you were not a large campaign donor to that race.
I gave the statutory permitted amount.
The number.
I was heavily involved in some arbitrations at that time. In fact, Jim Baker, of course, and other partners of mine at Baker Botts got heavily involved in the litigation following the election or leading up to the decision of the election. But I was sidetracked in some arbitrations that I couldn't finish out in time. So I didn't get into that part either.
Okay. Well, we get to July of 2001. So the president has been in office 6 months, plus or minus. Out of the White House comes a press release that indicates that Robert Jordan is going to be nominated by the White House as ambassador to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Walk us through those conversations, because at this point, we talked about some of the earlier years of your life, but you've got no diplomatic experience, never been in the State Department, never really served from an international standpoint, clearly some experience from a legal standpoint, but really not that background of a diplomat. And Saudi Arabia, even before 9/11, pretty significant with the issues that came in with President Clinton, trying to deal with the Abraham Accords, that sort of thing. So Middle East is still a hot item, not quite the 9/11 as it became.
Yeah.
Why Robert Jordan?
Well, first of all, the Saudis traditionally, for many years, had refused to give diplomatic credentials to a career foreign service officer to be the U.S. ambassador. They wanted someone who was a friend of the president, who could get the White House on the phone, who could go over the heads of the bureaucrats, and who didn't have a career to protect. And that was me. So in that sense, it was a perfect fit. I had enough knowledge of the oil business through my litigation experience, securities litigation, that I could talk a little bit about it. But the real currency was my relationship with the president. But it didn't start out like I was destined to have some sort of diplomatic career. When it became clear the president had been elected, I called him on his cell phone to congratulate him. And I got his voicemail. And so he calls me back and he gets my voicemail. And the voicemail, I have a tape somewhere, but it says, "Hey, Bob, this is George," or I guess I should say President-elect Bush returning your call. And he was no longer George after that. And we started talking about what I might do in his administration. And he said, "Don't wait for me to figure something out for you. You tell me what you'd like to do, and I'll tell you if I have an opening." So I said, "Well, I've been your lawyer. I don't know if White House counsel is taken, but that might be an avenue." And he said, "No, Al Gonzalez already is slated for that position." But then he says, the second and third top jobs at the Justice Department are still open. And John Ashcroft is the new Attorney General. Why don't you go see John and see how you guys hit it off? So I go over to see Ashcroft, and let's say we didn't hit it off. To his credit, he clearly wanted and was entitled to have his own people. He didn't want a Bush guy looking over his shoulder. And I didn't have any real criminal law experience. I had been court appointed as, pro bono counsel occasionally, but they really needed someone with some heavy criminal experience. So that was not me. So I figured it was over. This is probably February, March of 2001. Then finally, almost out of the blue, I get a call from Clay Johnson in the White House, who was the presidential personnel director. And he said, "Bob, how'd you like to be ambassador to Saudi Arabia? The president would like you to take that job." And I thought this was the worst idea I had ever heard.
Little did you know.
Yeah, this was long before 9/11.
Yeah.
But I had this image of a barren, nasty country where they had no human rights, no women's rights, no religious freedom, and just a terrible place. So I said, "Let me think about it, Clay." And I took about 3 or 4 weeks to think about it. It was very tough for me to decide this. My career was going great. It was just not something that was appealing to me, or my then wife, who also thought it was a terrible idea. But finally, I was debating in my head, and one of my sons was home from college, and he said, "Dad, I think I know what you've decided to do. You're going to do this, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Dad, when your friend, the President of the United States, asks you to serve your country, you're not going to say no, correct?" And I said, "You got it right." So that's sort of the decision-making process, and this took me into about April, I guess, of 2001.
And what was your expectation at the time? Because the Bush presidency, really, when he got elected, was a U.S.-focused presidency.
Exactly.
He was running really on education and other things. This was not a foreign policy type of presidency. So tell us about your expectations leading up to, obviously, the things that happened in September.
That's a great question. I had been in sort of training all summer. I'd go to Washington 2 or 3 days a week and meet with think tanks, military leaders, cabinet members, senators, and so forth. And then the Bushes invited me to come out to Crawford, to the ranch, to have lunch in August of 2001. And we start talking about what the job might be. And very clearly, the president said, "I want to be the education president. I don't have political capital right now because of how close the election was to waste, like, as he said, Clinton did in his last term, on the Middle East."
Well, President Bush really didn't believe that he could have an influence.
He didn't. Yeah. He thought he did not have the political capital or the ability to make it happen. He said, "If they get close enough where I can help close a deal, but right now I don't have partners for peace on either side." Yasser Arafat and Ariel Sharon hated each other, and each had an interest in keeping that struggle going. So that was where we left it in August of 2001.
Okay, so then up that period of 9/11, then you have been designated, you do the security checks, papers are in, nominations there, and you're doing this background work. You come up to 9/11.
Yeah, well, actually, the formal nomination had not gone in. It was scheduled to go in on September the 4th. Before 9/11, September the 4th, it was scheduled to go in. But apparently the White House counsel's office lost the paperwork. So they rescheduled the submission of the nomination for September the 11th. Of course, it didn't happen that day, but it happened on the 12th. And the press immediately says, oh, well, now that we've been attacked by Saudis, the president finally gets around to nominating somebody to be the ambassador, when, of course, it had been in the works for months.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Well, you've been preparing for this, so you've done your homework that. But then 9/11 comes.
Yeah.
Walk us through the emotions of that day, because you are going to be, and some people would call it the second most powerful person in Saudi Arabia, given the influence of the United States, the ambassador position, and that. All of a sudden, then you come up and you see the events of 9/11 unfold. What are your thoughts, your emotions, but also then intellectually, how does that change the way that you view the position?
Sure. That morning, the morning of the attacks, I was at a board meeting of the Dallas Foundation, and I'm sitting next to Albert Black, and in walks Walter Heumann. And Walt says, we've been attacked. And they turn the TV on, and we see the pictures of one of the towers being hit. And people start looking at me. And I'm saying to myself, oh, my goodness, this is very, very serious, life-changing, and it was really quite a tremendous shock. I immediately left, tried to get in touch with the State Department. They finally said, stay where you are, and we'll let you know later. And so for the next 2 or 3 days, I was in touch by phone, but not moving or going anywhere outside of Dallas at that point. And I'm having friends call me in tears saying, don't go. Don't go to
take the job.
This is a changed situation. You didn't sign up for this. And my response was, well, I signed up for whatever comes up.
Bingo.
Didn't have this in mind, but that's what you do when you say you're going to serve your country. I then conferred with Jim Baker, and he had been giving me great advice all throughout this whole process. But he said, Bob, this was going to be a really great position because this is one of those few political ambassador positions where you actually get to be a real ambassador. You make decisions. You have a lot of independence, and the host country really relies on you personally to speak on behalf of the president. But now, guess what? This is going to be really interesting in light of what's happened with these attacks. And so he strongly encouraged me, of course, to continue, which I did.
Well, of course, on the attacks, we see the planes go into World Trade Center, Pentagon, et cetera. But at that time, the focus is early on a group called Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
Shortly thereafter, though, we realize 15 of the 19 hijackers are Saudis.
Right.
Your reaction when you hear that?
It was shocking. And it was clear that as soon as I arrived over there, my first job was going to be to help figure out, are the Saudis friend or foe? Did they have royal family support? Did they have government support? We kept hearing—
Which is what the media in the United States now is implying.
Exactly, and religious figures as well. And there's a huge anti-Muslim sentiment coming out. And as an aside, I would add that immediately President Bush went to a Muslim mosque in Washington, D.C. to make it clear that this was not going to be a war on Islam. And you talk about leadership traits again. That is Exhibit A.
Let's talk water. Water is one of the most basic inputs in daily life and one of the least examined. Most people don't know what's actually coming out of their tap. In cities across the country, including Dallas, municipal water can contain elements like chlorine, lead, PFAS, and nitrates. These are measurable compounds, and ongoing research continues to explore their potential impact on long-term health. They test water at the home level, explain the results clearly, and recommend solutions based on what's actually needed, whether that's reverse osmosis, whole home water filtration, or something more targeted. They take care of all of it. To learn more, visit dallaswaterdoctor.com/intersections and mention the Intersections podcast for $200 off any filtration solution. Again, that's dallaswater.com/intersections. Thank you to the Dallas Water Doctor team for everything you do to support the Intersections podcast. So you're confirmed.
Yeah.
Talk us through the first day you land in Saudi Arabia. What was that like? Tell us about the first 24, 36 hours.
Yeah.
What'd you do? Where'd you get your feet wet, et cetera?
Well, I arrived sort of early evening. It's dark. It gets dark in Saudi very early. And I was met at the gate by my deputy chief of mission, Margaret Scobie, a woman, a 30-year veteran of the State Department. She later became ambassador to Syria and also then to Egypt at the time Mubarak went down. So she was a real pro. But I was also met by my 6 new best friends, my Saudi bodyguards. And they show up in their white robes, checkered headdresses, and shoulder holsters. And again, I'm wondering, can I trust these guys or not? I don't know what I'm getting into here. I trusted Margaret, of course, but she had only been there about 15 days as well. So we sort of worked our way through it ourselves, but we went to my new residence, met my staff. They fixed me a sandwich, and we started talking. Margaret and I started talking about, what the next day would be. Next day, I showed up, had my country team meeting, which is all of the heads of departments, heavily relying on my CIA station chief, who was fantastic. I had a great staff. But they were in shock to some degree as well. And obviously the fact that it was 15 Saudis weighed heavily on everything they were doing. So I'm trying to find out from them what they can tell me about the Saudi attitudes. And I think we have to remember that this was at the time of what's called the Second Intifada, which was Yasser Arafat basically declaring war on the U.S. Western interests as a consequence of the Palestinian issue. And the people on the street, I guess I would say, were very anti-American at this point. And I'm sure some of them were, probably many of them were celebrating the attacks of 9/11. And so part of what we're dealing with is a Saudi royal family and regime that is much more pro-U.S., pro-Western historically, but the population is probably equally angry at the U.S. Their view was that President Bush could snap his fingers and make Ariel Sharon do whatever he wanted him to do, and therefore could make him back off on the conflict with the Palestinians.
In your book, it's a great book, by the way, but it has pages, maybe different for you, Desert Diplomat. You spent a lot of time talking about initial reactions of the Saudi royal family, Saudi government, realize they're combined. And I think you use the words denial. That they were just in denial over the attacks at Cedra.
Right.
And that was surprising to you. Talk about that situation and those initial conversations. And then leading up to Prince Faisal was being the one that kind of took a different view.
Correct. I started out getting appointments to see some of the top leadership. And so my first appointment was Prince Salman, who is now the king. But he was governor of Riyadh province at the time, which was a very big job. It's maybe like being governor of New York or California. It's probably the most important governorship they have. And he had been kind of the sheriff of the royal family. He was the one who disciplined the wayward princes and really knew all the family secrets. And so I went to see him, and I asked him, how could it be that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis? And he said, oh, no. There were no Saudis involved in this. This was an Israeli plot. The Israelis did this to drive a wedge between the United States and Saudi Arabia. Well, this was preposterous, of course, and I really couldn't believe what I was hearing. So my next appointment was the Minister of Interior, which is kind of like our FBI. It's the internal security of the country. And this was Prince Nayef. And I asked him the same question, and I got the same answer. This was the Israelis who did it. And they simply couldn't figure out what to say. And I don't know if they knew the falsehoods they were spouting, if someone had prepped them on this, or if that's what they were saying in the mosques. I just don't know exactly how that came about. I never did find out why they kept saying that. The best I can figure And, I have 3 sons. I guess if my 3 sons were accused of attacking the World Trade Center and taking it down, I would be very hesitant to believe it. I'd want to find some other explanation. And that may be what was operating here.
Mm-hmm.
But in any event, I finally had an appointment with Prince Saud al-Faisal, who was the son of the late King Faisal, who was a progressive yet strongly Islamist king in the mid-'70s. And Prince Saud understood what was going on. He was well educated. He went to Princeton. He spoke better English than I did.
Mm-hmm.
And he understood they had a real extremism problem in their midst, and this was a product of it in many ways. And so he seemed more realistic, more resolved to work with American interests to see what we could do to help them.
Well, and I wanted to do just a brief interlude to give the audience a view of where Saudi Arabia was also economically at this time, because I think as the Middle East has grown and expanded, obviously influence around oil and gas has been a big deal.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us where they stood? I think obviously we know that Saudi Arabia has grown significantly, and so has the Middle East the last 25 years. But where were they economically in terms of oil exporting, et cetera, at that time too?
They were a huge producer, part of OPEC.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, President Bush asked me to see if I could keep the Saudis producing gas priced at around $23 a barrel. They wanted 28. I think we ended up at 25 much of the time I was there. But they had spent much of their reserves as a consequence of the first Gulf War. Because America had come in with a huge coalition to repel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And Saudi was next on his list to attack. The U.S. government decided that we needed to essentially get the Saudis and others to pay for the war. So Jim Baker went around with what was called a 10-cup exercise, raising money from the Gulf monarchies. And I think the tab for the Saudis was about $50 billion. At that time, their debt to GDP ratio was not very good. And so paying that $50 billion almost bankrupted them. They did not have massive cash reserves at that point. And so this was something that was also weighing on them.
We talked a little bit earlier. The sentiment in the United States, when we hear 15 out of 19, is Saudi Arabia is involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
That you just couldn't have that large a number.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the view goes back to 1932 when the kingdom came into play. And my understanding is largely the royal family delegated the educational system to the Wahhabi sect. And at that point, through the 50s and 60s, 50s, 60s being the pivot point, that education system took a strong leftward move, differentiated from the rest of Saudi Arabia, but that was where a lot of the anti-American, pro-Islamic, anti-West sentiments came from.
Yeah.
Is that fair? And then talk about how you saw the Saudi family in that dereliction of duty, given an education system that they've lost control of.
Sure. It was even more than the education system, but they brought in a huge number of teachers from Egypt who had been kicked out of Egypt for being too extremist. And they then took over the schools in the 50s and 60s and inculcated a lot of anti-Western, anti-Christian values, particularly in their textbooks. Their textbooks would compare Jews to monkeys. They would have math problems. How many jihadis does it take to end up with, 20 bombs or something like that? It was a very militant kind of attitude that they came in with. But what really then turned the tide even more toward extremism was the Iranian Revolution in 1979, where the Shah was thrown out. And the Saudis took a lesson from that, which was the Shah had not been sufficiently religious. And the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia was starting to complain about the Saudis being playboys, being off in the Riviera.
And that was the year of the Grand Mosque.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Grand Mosque is seized by militant extremists.
Yep.
And they had to get French mercenaries to come in and take them out of the mosque. And so the lesson they thought they learned from that was they needed to rely more on the religious establishment. And so in addition to the education system, they delegated much of the cultural and domestic authority to the religious police. We got the Mutawa, which was the religious police. Women who had been dressed more casually up until this point had to cover more. They had to wear the abayas, the headscarves. They couldn't go anywhere without a male relative's consent. And this really started a very dark period in Saudi Arabia, partly because the regime felt insecure. They were worried about their legitimacy in light of what they had seen happen in Iran.
Well, when you came in, you saw the autocracy, you saw the lack of religious rights, the lack of rights for women, those sorts of things. Talk a little bit about that environment, what your reaction to it was, and kind of where the family stood on it.
There was, I would say, a diversity of opinion in the senior cadre of the royal family. Prince Talal, who was called the Red Prince at one time because he was sympathetic to some of the far-left views and was the father of Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, who became the world's richest man at one point, was on one side. He was pretty well kept out of the inner family circles after that turn. And then you had Prince Saud al-Faisal, who was, again, well-educated, sophisticated, the longest-serving foreign minister in the world, I think, at that particular time, and very close to many of the Western leaders, including the Bush family. You had others, though. Prince Abdullah, who later became king, it was the crown prince when I was there, was not enamored with the U.S., but understood the transactional nature of needing to deal with the U.S. And so you had a fairly wide variety of opinions about that. But they were all largely in denial about the extent of extremism in their midst. Later in 2003, when we had these suicide bombings in Western housing compounds, was, I think, the moment they realized Al-Qaeda was in their midst. And Al-Qaeda was intent on bringing down the royal family as much as they were going after the Americans.
Well, let's lead into that, because now you're ambassador and you've got a full plate. You've got issues ranging from counterintelligence all the way to convincing the Saudi family, the government, that they need to cooperate with us on the war on terror, which means logistics, basing, a whole host of different issues associated with that. One of the things, again, in your book that you talked about, though, was the, shall we say, the incompetence or at least the bureaucratic nature of the U.S. and the relationship between CIA, State Department, FBI, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of two parts of the question, Ambassador. One, as you look back on that, did that contribute to the attacks? In other words, could we have been more effective in dealing with them if we didn't have that siloed approach? And two is, how did you go about kind of ripping some of those walls down? Because you had to have those walls down for you to get the information you needed.
Yeah. Well, this is where being a political appointee, non-career, comes in handy, because I didn't have a career to protect, and I could take some strong positions without worrying how that might affect my future. I do think some of the silos and some of the poor communication contributed to a lack of full information, for example, within the National Security Council. I know Richard Clarke, who wrote a book about this, was concerned that there could be an attack through maybe aircraft or something like that on our homeland. He claims, and I've talked with him about this, that those warnings were largely ignored within the national security apparatus at a time when it should have been paid more attention to. He may well be right about that. What I saw was a an FBI that was culturally so focused on getting what we would call collars, or getting arrests made and convictions, that they lost sight of the importance of gaining intelligence, sharing it with the CIA and other intelligence agencies in a way that could prevent some of those crimes or some of those attacks. The CIA, on the other hand, was so dismissive of the FBI as being, amateurs and not qualified in many ways, that they didn't particularly play nice with them either. So, an example was the CIA had asked for a list of potential either suspects or witnesses for interrogation, and they had not been receiving any responses from the Saudis. So I went into the Minister of Interior, Prince Naif, pounded the table, and I said, "We've got to. This is urgent. We've been attacked. We've got a sense of urgency here. You guys don't seem to have it." And he says, "Well, Mr. Ambassador, we gave that list to the FBI 2 weeks ago. Why don't you talk to your own government?" So
tough conversation.
I pretty well blew up at that point, and luckily, I had a scheduled trip back to Washington. I went back. I went to see Bob Mueller.
Yeah, who's FBI director.
Who had just become the head of the FBI like a day or two before 9/11.
Yeah, I was going to say a week before the attacks.
And he had been a U.S. attorney. And I told him we had a real problem. It's a cultural problem, among other things. You guys have got to share information. Then I went over to the CIA and said the same thing to George Tenet, who was the head of the CIA. And to the credit of both of them, they actually did a remarkable job of improving the communication, improving the relationships, and particularly on the FBI, professionalizing their international operations. I think at the time of 9/11, the FBI only had 3 Arabic speakers in the entire bureau, which is absurd.
Wow.
But I have to give Mueller enormous credit for really modernizing and professionalizing the FBI.
And really shifting it from, as you said, callers to kind of building intelligence and understanding.
Correct.
2 critical meetings during your time as ambassador. The first one is the Crown Prince comes to Crawford, a ranch, hour outside Waco, plus or minus. You were kind of the point person on that between the president and between the Crown Prince. And at this time, we need a lot from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's got a lot of questions. Talk about that meeting and the successes that came out of it.
There was enormous tension between the Americans and the Saudis at this point. This is April of 2002. The Intifada is raging, no progress in reining in the Israeli punitive actions against the Palestinians or the Palestinian violence against Israelis. The Crown Prince had been thinking of rejecting the invitation to come to Crawford. In fact, I met with him, and he said, "Why am I not going to the White House? That's, what you have a head of state, that's where you go." And I said, "Oh, no. I'm scrambling." But I said, "Oh, no, Your Royal Highness. This is a great honor. This is the president's home, personal home. And it is a great honor in America to be invited to the personal home, particularly of an American president." Well, he bought the explanation and stayed with the trip. But the Saudis had presented, as you do for any summit meeting, supposedly in most summit meetings, all the details are worked out ahead of time by the staff and approved by the heads of state. So the Saudis had submitted a list of 8 demands that they wanted the American government to deal with, mostly having to do with the Palestinians and other things like that. And we got into the meeting, and Prince Saud al-Faisal, the foreign minister, says, "So where are we on the 8 demands?" And the president says, "What 8 demands? I don't know what you're talking about." And looking into it, we later learned that the demands had actually been taken by the vice president's office, Cheney's office, and President Bush knew nothing about them.
Wow.
And so we had to scramble, and it looked like the entire meeting was going to fall apart. In fact, let me backtrack. We met Crown Prince Abdullah. Colin Powell and I met him at an airstrip outside of Waco. And he refuses to fly in helicopters. So the Crown Prince had chartered a tour bus to take our entire delegation the 1-hour drive to Crawford. And this bus shows up, and it's got pinstripes. It looks like it's Dolly Parton going on tour. And Powell then says to me, as we're waiting for the Crown Prince to get off his 747 and join us, he says, "By the way, Bob,
747 to bus.
Yeah. This whole meeting may blow up because the Saudis are really unhappy, and they've threatened to even not be here, as you know. But I'm going to stay behind with President Bush and Condi Rice to do a press conference. And so however it ends up, you're going back on the bus with the Crown Prince and the Saudi delegation." So I had this nightmare view of
sacrificial lamb
going back after they've broken relations with the United States. So it's very tense. Our State Department interpreter comes in during a break in the meeting, and he says, "I think the Saudis are getting ready to walk out. You don't know about these 8 demands." One of them was to get Yasser Arafat.
To interrupt, what did Cheney say at this point in time?
I don't think he was there. Oh, he was not there because he had torn his Achilles tendon. We had a dinner.
There was a call back to him that said, "Where are the 8?"
Well, there were staff people there who I think knew about it. I think he had a staff person who knew about it, who was there. And we got hold of the 8 points. And one of them was that Yasser Arafat had been confined to his headquarters in Ramallah. And he was basically blockaded in there. There was also a siege at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem.
Yeah, Bethlehem. Yeah.
And so 2 of the demands were end the siege on Arafat, end the siege at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. So Condi Rice calls up the Israeli National Security Advisor in the middle of the night, his time, and says, "You guys have got to fix this right now." And they did. So it's a pretty good example of flexibility, of scrambling, of trying to figure out ways to make it work. And in the meantime, Bush, again, great leadership here, says, "All right, we're taking a break. I'm going to take the Crown Prince for a ride around the ranch in my pickup." Now, I've taken that same ride with the president. He is so proud of this ranch, and he has a great F-250 pickup truck, Ford pickup. And so he gets in with the Crown Prince, and they go off by themselves in the truck, and then the Secret Service is following behind. And they go around, and as they have both told the story, they're coming back, and a wild turkey crosses the road in front of them on this dirt road they're going on. And the Crown Prince says, "This is an omen. It means our meeting is going to be successful." And I think what it really was George Bush's integrity, his charm, his leadership came through to the Crown Prince in a way that they had not fully appreciated before. And actually, I think being in Crawford helped as well. It was his home. And he could see the earthiness of the man. And Crown Prince Abdullah was an earthy guy himself. He had a farm outside of Casablanca in Morocco that Colin Powell and I went to one time.
Do you think he had F-250s, though?
No, I don't think so. But and he wouldn't have been driving them if he had. But it showed you that there was a certain commonality they had, a certain sincerity about each of them that played very well in that very difficult moment. And so we finished the meeting. Everyone shook hands, and the Saudis are delirious at this point, especially Prince Bandar, the Saudi ambassador, and Prince Saud al-Faisal, the foreign minister. And
because of the 8?
Because they got enough settled that it was considered a success. And clearly, the Crown Prince hit it off with Bush. So we get on the tour bus to go back, and Powell stays behind with Condi. And Saud and Bandar are so delirious, they start singing Broadway show tunes. Like My Fair Lady, "The rain in Spain falls mainly in the plain. Why can't a woman be like a man?" All of these things, they're just riffing back and forth with each other. And so at least in one sense, something in the Middle East had a happy ending at that moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to the second meeting, which may not fall into that category. You're called to a meeting with President Bush.
Mm-hmm.
He tells you that we are going to go for regime change in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Saudis aren't very excited about this.
Right.
You walk out of the meeting.
He said that he wanted me to be his point man with the Saudis because we couldn't accomplish an invasion without the use of Saudi bases, Saudi border crossings, and the Saudi prestige within the Islamic community.
And when was this? Just for the audience.
This was December of 2002. So I went out to the State Department car. He told me this in the White House in the Oval Office. I left and I took a note card out and just made a note to myself. I think it was December 12, 2002. And he said, we're fixing to do a regime change in Iraq. And so I was pondering, this was, in my view, kind of a historic moment. There had been many discussions about the need for the weapons inspectors to continue their work, continue more work in the United Nations. Mm-hmm. We had congressional support already, but it was still a very fluid situation. But clear to me that the president was dead set on going ahead with a regime change. So that was a very important thing for me to think through, and then we start marshaling the attitudes that we needed to convert. The Saudis thought we didn't really know what we were doing. The public statements by the Saudis were very negative about any invasion of Iraq, but behind the scenes, I'm getting cues from the son of the king, for example, Mohammed bin Fahd. Abdulaziz bin Fahd. I'm getting cues from members of the civil society, some of the plutocrats involved in Saudi Arabia, that the relationship with the United States was so important that if push came to shove and we were really going to do this, then they were not going to be an impediment, basically.
I'm not sure, but the 12th day of the month is a pretty interesting one for the ambassador. White House announces it in July of 2001. It gets filed on the 12th of September, October 12th, then December 12th, but then things get worse. It's May 12th of 2003.
Yeah.
The bombings in Riyadh.
Yep.
Talk about that, how it changed both the situation for the Saudis and their view of the world, the war on terror, but also how it changed for you personally, too.
Yeah, that's a very important time. In late April, early May, I was getting intelligence reports that, contrary to their previous practice, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were now contemplating actually launching attacks within Saudi Arabia. Up to this point, they've been receiving a lot of money from the mosques and so forth in Saudi Arabia, from charities that were on the dark side. But this appeared to be a change. And so I sent 3 letters to the Saudi leadership asking for additional protection at Western housing compounds.
And what was the protection like, just for the audience? Give us an understanding what the protection was like.
They were generally private security guards.
Okay.
Not heavily armed, probably not heavily experienced. And some of them were indolent. They didn't stay at their posts. Even some of the private guards around my residence would take long lunch breaks and leave their weapons at their guardhouse unattended. So there was a lack of real order and discipline there as well. And the Saudis had ignored my letters. So the attacks come in the middle of the night. And it happened that Colin Powell was on his way to Riyadh already for a previously scheduled meeting with the Crown Prince. So I met him. We go to see the Crown Prince early in the morning. And before the meeting starts, the Crown Prince turns to me and says, "Mr. Ambassador, I owe you an apology. You had asked for more security at the Western housing compounds, and I was the one who decided you didn't need them. But I can assure you from this day forward We will capture or kill anyone involved in these attacks. We will treat just as harshly anyone who even gives them aid or comfort, or anyone who tries to rationalize what they did. And sure enough, he kept his word. They launched billboards on highways saying, "Say no to terrorism." They attacked safe houses and of Al-Qaeda. They found a number of their cells, rooted them out, killed them or arrested them. And the remnants of Al-Qaeda then basically fled to Yemen after that. So it was a real turning point. Yeah. And we spent a lot of time. George Tenet came out quite a bit at that time with the CIA people, National Security Council people. Steve Hadley came out a good bit. And we really started working finally in a genuine partnership with the Saudis once they received this wake-up call.
Well, and how did your living conditions look different? Tell us the stories there. In the midst of a survey, and also, of course, we didn't know if more attacks were on the way or not. And so we had a security sweep of the embassy and my residence, which was about...
And dependencies of the embassy personnel.
I had ordered all embassy dependents and non-essential personnel to leave the kingdom, which greatly upset the Saudis, by the way. That they took that as a sign of no confidence in them, which it was. But they responded appropriately. So after the security survey of my residence, they decided my residence was not secure. And I then started sleeping at an undisclosed location every night. So I'd go to the residence, I'd have dinner, then I would go down my back stairs and get down on the floor of the back of a Suburban, and they would drive me out past my own gate guards to a couple of different places, apartments that they would take me to, and American security people with machine guns would stand guard out in front of my bedroom door while I would sleep, or try to. And this lasted about a month. Then I had to go back to Washington for a meeting, so I left for 2 or 3 weeks. And when I came back, they said the security problem had been solved. The security problem they identified was that we didn't have cameras on the back of my perimeter. And there was what's called a wadi back there, which is basically a dry canyon, creek bed. And terrorists could creep through the wadi, climb up over the wall, and come in to the residence grounds that way. Now, they didn't have a budget for new cameras, and so what they did was they took camera housings and mounted them on the back wall to make the supposed terrorists think that we had camera surveillance back there. Man, you can't make this up, but that's exactly what they did.
And how did you feel about that?
Well, I wasn't greatly encouraged, but I didn't want to keep sleeping in undisclosed locations, so I just decided. They also doubled some of the human security patrols going around, but it was not particularly reassuring.
One thing you were involved in that made a big difference for Saudi Arabia and the United States didn't come to fruition until after you left office, but you were involved in most of the work, and that's the World Trade Organization, admission Saudi Arabia to the World Trade Association. Talk about that, and then how it did come to fruition, the recognition that you received.
Well, that was a very important project that I undertook. We didn't give the Saudis foreign aid. We didn't have many levers over them to require them to modernize their economy, to modernize their culture, to be more of the part of the family of nations. But they had been wanting to join the World Trade Organization. During the Clinton administration, China had been the big WTO applicant, and the staff of the U.S. Trade Representative, headed by Bob Zoellick at the time, was exhausted. And they have a very small staff. They work out of a small townhouse, and they just had no interest in dealing with the Saudis during the Clinton administration. I think at that time Charlene Barshevsky was Clinton's trade representative, and she wouldn't return Saudi phone calls, is what I was told. And so it was clear to me that if we could get the Saudis to do everything they had to qualify for membership in the WTO, that would be a breakthrough from a business and cultural standpoint that would have great resonance. So I started working on it, but I had to get my own government enlisted in it first and kind of elevate it to a political level instead of just some administrative drill. So I went to Washington. I talked to Condi Rice. She thought it was a great idea. I said, Condi, these people will be required to modernize their insurance codes, their legal system, their everything they do internationally from a trade standpoint. That will bring them into compliance. They will have more foreign direct investment. They will have more tourism. They will have a lot of other benefits that come from this. And so she said, great. I went to see Vice President Cheney. He agreed. Then I went to see Don Evans, who was the Secretary of Commerce, and he agreed. So Bob Zoellick, who was the U.S. Trade Representative under Bush, again, his staff was exhausted. He didn't have much sympathy for the Saudis, but I went in to him and I said, so Bob, the White House supports this. The Vice President supports it. Secretary of Commerce supports it. Bob, do you think we can get this done? And he sort of rolled his eyes and said, okay, we'll do it. And he assigned some great people to it. But then the Saudis, as much as they claimed they wanted to go in, their Minister of Commerce at the time clearly didn't want to do anything that would westernize or modernize
the reforms that were necessary.
The reforms that were necessary. And so he was in a constant impediment. I made a really nice friendship with the head of the Jeddah Chamber of Commerce named Abdullah Al-Reza. And Abdullah became sort of my spokesman in a way to deal with the leadership in Saudi. But finally, I just went in to see the Crown Prince and I said, I'm sorry, we've tried our best to get you guys into the WTO, but your Minister of Commerce is just not cooperating. 2 weeks later, he was fired.
Wow.
And who replaced him? Abdullah Al-Reza. And so Abdullah became just a tremendous ally in getting all of this done. One time we got hung up and just couldn't get everyone on the same page. I think it had to do with whether the Saudis could be required to allow the importation of pork and alcohol into the kingdom. But there are certain religious exceptions to some of the WTO requirements. And so I got everyone to a meeting in Geneva, the WTO headquarters, Saudi delegation, American delegation. And the Americans start saying, they have to agree to import pork and alcohol. And I said, well, you know what? There's a WTO member that doesn't have to do that, and it's called Israel. So what do you think? Can we do the same thing Israel does? Oh, we hadn't thought of that. Yeah. So finally we got across that hurdle. But it still wasn't done by the time I left office in October of 2003. So several months pass. We have a new ambassador in early 2004 in Riyadh, Jim Oberwetter, who
Another Dallas.
From Dallas, head of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, great guy. And my phone rings somewhere in 2004, maybe even 2005. And it's Jim Oberwetter on the phone. He says, Bob, I'm sitting here at the headquarters of the WTO in Geneva, and we are signing up the Saudi accession to the WTO, and I just want to pass the phone around, let everyone here congratulate you for getting this thing started.
Really cool.
That's great.
Man, that made my day.
That's cool.
Well, 2 years, long days, probably short years, but you made the decision to leave.
Yeah.
Talk about that decision to leave, because a job like that, it's never done. There's always a to-do list.
Yeah. To flash back, one time when I was spending a lot of time with George Bush when he was governor, I was advising him on judicial appointments and various things, and he offered me a spot on the Texas Supreme Court. And I said, I'd love to, but right now, I've got kids to educate. I've just got a career that I've got to develop. But down the line, maybe I could do it. And he says, Jordan, down the line, I ain't going to be here. Either do it or don't do it. Well, I declined. So I was reminded of—
And your name by President Bush was Jourdain?
Jourdan. Like Louis Jourdan, who was a French actor, Jourdain or something. He had nicknames for everyone. His favorite nickname for Karl Rove was Turd Blossom. And
a term of endearment.
It became one, yes. Yeah. Which Carl, I think, has never lived down. But it became clear to me that I had a career to get back to. It's sort of like if you're a doctor, you can't take 5 years off from your practice and come back to it with any skill set. But beyond the skill set, when you leave a business or a law practice to go into government, you don't go on a leave of absence. You resign. You are not allowed to have a contingent right of return, if you will. So I had to be readmitted to my law firm. But in the meantime, I had given all my clients away when I left. And you can't go back to the guys, your partners, and say, hey, I want those clients back now. You have to basically reinvent yourself and start over. So I knew this was going to be a process as well. So and in my hesitancy to take the job in the first place, Clay Johnson had said, can you do it for a year? And I said, sure, I can do anything for a year. He said, fine, you're hired. Just stay as long as you can, but give us as much notice as you can when you decide you want to leave. So in June of 2003, I was at a presidential summit with the president and Condi in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And we had finished the invasion of Iraq. I had got the WTO stuff going pretty well. And I figured this was probably somewhere down the line in the fall would be a good time for me to leave. So I told the president that, and he said, thanks much. You've done a great job. And so I ended up leaving in October. So it was almost 2 years to the day after I started.
Wow.
So Kyle's going to be an ambassador in a couple decades.
I have no doubt. He was one of my students and a great student.
Exactly. I was going to point that out. After all of your experiences, what advice would you give him? The same that Jim Baker gave you, or would it be different after those years?
Well, it'd certainly start with Jim Baker. And one of the things Jim Baker told me was a great story. And it was actually a story about George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State, of course, legendary Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. And each new ambassador would go in to meet with Shultz. And he would give them sort of a pep talk and talk about the country they were going to and so forth. And he would take them over to a table where he had a spinning globe. And he would spin the globe and he would say, put your finger on your country. 99 times out of 100, the new ambassador would point their finger at the country they were going to. And Shultz would say, wrong. Your country is the United States of America. Don't you forget it. And Baker turned that into a saying that I'll never forget also. And he said, Bob, don't get clientitis. Don't fall in love with your host country. So many ambassadors start becoming advocates for the host country rather than for American policy. Now, there's a fine line there because at some point it's easy, as in the case of Saudi Arabia, for the people back home to misunderstand where they're coming from, or to misunderstand what their attitudes are, or to tar them with the same brush that you do, in too broad a sense. So you have to point out nuances. You have to point out where American interests are served by better understanding the host country. But not getting clientitis was great advice. And then I'll also go back to what I said at the beginning, which is where you stand depends on where you sit. These people get to have a foreign policy. And what you have to do is figure it out and see how it works for American interests.
A lot of your time during that 2 years was a time of crisis.
Yeah.
Both at the White House and in Riyadh. What lessons of leadership in crisis situations did you learn?
I think you learn that it's never as bad as you think it is. That you have the skill set to work your way through it if you stick to your routine, your procedures, your chains of command. I think it also helps to have a religious faith. Mm-hmm. I think it helps to have good personal relationships with as many people as possible, people who trust you, both above your chain of command and below. it's like having allies. Winston Churchill said, the only thing worse than fighting with your allies is fighting without them. And so I think you've got to garner as many relationships as possible. This is something that Jim Baker was so good at in the first Gulf War, especially. Gathering that coalition together, getting the Russians to vote with us in the United Nations was really an amazing success.
Ambassador, I think over the course of the last hour or so, you have shown us not only the experience that you developed in that part of the world, but also your perceptive and insightful thoughts of understanding different cultures, different parts of the world, and how they all come together. We appreciate you being with us.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode. Again, today's episode is sponsored by Clay Cooley Automotive, a family-owned, family-operated automotive company serving the local DFW Metroplex for over 22 years.